Okay, so here we go with another phylum within the protostomes. This is going to be Phylum Annelida, or we often say just the Annelids. Remember the roadmap. We are still talking about organisms that fit under protostomes. Then they go under Spirilia. Then they go underneath Lophotrochozoa. And then we're down to the phylum Annelida. Now, within Annelida, we break it up typically into two groups. Traditional classification had it as three groups, but we're going to approach it as the two. The first group are the Polychaetes or Polychaeta. And then the second group is, let me get this out of here, is the Clitellata, or the earthworms and leeches. Now, traditionally, earthworms were broken up into their own class called Oligochaeta, and then the leeches went into their own class known as Hydrostatic, but new classification has merged those two into Clitellata, and I'll show you why that merge occurred. Again, most sources are moved to Clitellata. Older resources or references still retain them as separate classes within the phylum Annelida. So, all right, but the first starting point, as always, is what makes something an annelid or a member of phylum Annelida? So we're going to go through the key features, list those out, say, all right, this is what makes these guys go into this phylum versus phylum Mollusca versus phylum Nemertia, phylum Rotifera, and so on. So what are the key criteria for this particular phylum? So, all right, so let me do this. Okay, so features used to classify an member of Annelida. They have a segmented body plan. So you look at an earthworm and it's got all those little segments. Kind of makes sense. They're not the only segmented animal out there. So we need additional criteria. The segments often are specialized. So we'll see that as a feature among these guys. We get some specialization where certain parts are in this segment and they're not in, excuse me, not in other segments. So, and I'll talk about that term we used earlier called cephalization, where you got a head end. Now you start getting specialized segments, so on. We will see septa. Septa. Septa are dividing walls that separate the segments from each other. So let me use green. So right here would be a septa, here would be a septa, here would be another one. Now, granted they have these dividing walls, things still pass through the walls. There's blood vessels, there's nerves, there's digestive systems that go through those walls that divide the segments. So very loose comparison. If you guys are familiar with your diaphragm, that separates your abdominal cavity from your thoracic, chest from abdomen. But stuff still, blood vessels and things still pass through the diaphragm. It just, the diaphragm seals around them. That's the same concept with the septa, except in the segmented worms, there's a whole bunch of septa. I mean, some of these worms, you may have hundreds of septa, hundreds of segments making up their body plan. Okay, another neat feature. The members of this phylum have a thing called a hydrostatic skeleton. So what they'll do with this hydrostatic skeleton is they use it to move. So they have circular and longitudinal muscles, and we'll talk more about this later. The muscles contract and squeeze to enable the movement of, think about a typical earthworm's movement. Right? So a very unique structure when we talk about the hydrostatic skeleton. Embedded to or attached to the hydrostatic skeleton are often these little things called setae, and this is not across all of them, but across a lot of the annelids, these little hair-like structures. And again, I'll get into that as we get into the different groups of annelids here. So, okay, and then the last major structure I want to mention, major feature to identify organisms as members of Annelida are they have these segmented excretory systems. And there's these specialized little structures called nephridia or nephridium. Hopefully that sounds a little familiar. So nephridia are going to act kind of like the kidney structures, and that's going to help excrete waste out the body. Usually there's these little tubes that enable the waste to be kind of ejected or excreted out of the body with these little nephridia or nephridium structures. Okay, so big key features that as we're looking at an animal, we say, okay, it's a protostome, it's a member of Spirilia, Lophotrochozoa. Now, what'll move it into that phylum versus any of the other phylum we've talked about, or any of the other phylum we will talk about in future lectures? So, kind of pull together that collection of criteria. Go, okay, this makes you a member of Annelida. There we go. Now, once you're in Annelida, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to break you down into two different classes. So the first one is, and let's label this as the class Polychaeta. These are the polychaetes, or we can call them the bristle worms. Be very careful with these. By and large, these are marine species. Beautiful animals. Anybody who has a chance to go snorkeling or diving, you're probably going to see them on the reef. They are typically carnivores. So when we talk about ecological role, these are eating other things. Let me get rid of that bold. Active little predators going along eating stuff. Now, what makes these guys different, what puts them into their own class, is that they have these structures known as parapodia. Parapodia are these little paddle-like segments on the side of the body. And I'll show you guys a zoomed up view of them in just a second here. And then each segment will contain, let me move it over, these little setae. Now the setae are the things that you need to be careful of. Setae are tiny little hairs or hair-like structures. Those are the things that can be very, very problematic. Why we call them bristle worms. Imagine a bunch of fiberglass sticking out of the side of these animals. That's what the setae are for. A lot of the setae can be used for defense, can help with movement, can help with increasing surface area for respiration. Actually, let's just go with gas exchange. But the biggest concern is the defense side of it. So here's a better example. So this paddle-like structure sticking out here, this is the parapodia. There's another one here, another one here. These are parapodia, okay? So little paddles, got to move things around. Here's an enlarged view of it, parapodia over here. There's another one there. Okay, now sticking out of the parapodia, that's a scary thing, or can be scary. These little bristles, these little hairs, these little fibers, those are the setae. Depending upon the organism, the setae contain little toxins, little proteins, and they are not pleasant at all if you get into contact with them. Most of the time, they're just crawling around. These guys are eating stuff. Sometimes they use their parapodia and setae to filter feed, grab plankton and anything floating in the water, grab it out of the water. But like this guy here, this beautiful worm here, called a bristle worm. It's actually called a fire worm. You pick it up and it's crawling around on your hand. Probably not going to notice it right away, but lots of those little setae are breaking off and embedding themselves into your skin. They have a little bit of toxin. If they get pushed down deep enough through the outer layer of your skin into the deeper tissue, then you're going to notice, and it's going to hurt bad. That little worm is called fireworm for a reason, because the toxin they have in those setae is very, very unpleasant and quite painful. So again, there's always a word of caution when you're snorkeling or diving, you're in the ocean. Don't just pick stuff up. You don't want to touch stuff unless you know what it is, because if it's that pretty, it's probably pretty darn dangerous or has an unbelievably strong defense system. So word of caution for any snorkelers or divers, marine biologists out there. You'll learn the hard way. You'll do it once and then you'll remember, don't pick up the fireworm. Another variation on this plant is this thing called a Christmas tree worm. There's all sorts of different varieties out there. There's the Christmas tree worm, there's the feather dusters, tube worms, etc. So the way these guys work, they will often build a tube, and like the feather duster, it'll build a tube out of little pebbles and grains of sand and the Annelids version of spit. The worm lives inside the tube, and then what it does is it pushes out its setae, and the setae are modified into this, looks almost like a fan, or if you guys have ever seen the old-fashioned feather dusters, pushes this out. So anything floating around in the water, in the plankton load that gets caught in here, the setae are actually sticky. They don't break off with toxins. It's sticky. Then that gets pulled down into the mouth and into the digestive system of the worm. It feeds on it, puts its feathers out, and grabs more stuff. So watch the little feather duster video. You can let me know, please let me know if the link doesn't work, or you can just go to YouTube and Google feather duster. There's some neat videos about these guys. Pretty interesting little animals. They are animals. They are actually worms. They're annelids. Most of the time when people see these, they think there's some kind of plant or they're just not sure what it is. But it is actually an animal and a member of the Polychaeta class. So Phylum Annelida, class Polychaeta. All right, so again, some interesting, beautiful creatures in the marine world. All right, so that is it for class Polychaeta. The second class is, put it up here, Clitellata. Oop. Should I spell right? All right, so Clitellata. These are the earthworms and leeches. As I mentioned before, traditionally they were classified as, earthworms were classified as Oligochaeta and the leeches Hydrostatic. Reorganization has moved them together. All right, so now, big thing about earthworms, they are annelids. They have all those annelid features. But what makes an earthworm different than a member of the Polychaeta is that earthworms lack parapodia. They still have the setae, but they don't have the parapodia. So they don't have those little segments sticking out, but they do have the little bristly hairs. Okay, so in the next lecture, we're going to talk more about Clitellata, take a look at the earthworms and the leeches.